When you have a small team and you need to produce big results, it's essential that every member of your team is performing at their best. Training and skill development is one area that can make a dramatic difference in your team's results. But when you're small, having the time and bandwidth to continually train and mentor your team can feel overwhelming. So how do you hyper-focus your time and energy in training in a way that will have the biggest impact? Join me for this episode of Sales Fiction, where I dive into some key principles that will help you focus your training efforts for maximum growth. Welcome to Sales Fiction, a podcast that helps small sales teams get big results. I'm your host, Christy Lawrence, the founder of Mighty Sales and a longtime sales professional who traded my corporate sales career to help small but mighty teams do more with less. Each week on this podcast, we separate sales fact from sales fiction so that you can hyper-focus your effort on the skills, strategies, and tools that will have the biggest impact on your bottom line. Let's dive right in. So I've been thinking a lot about this idea of how do you develop over time your sales team? And the framework that I'm using as I've been thinking about how I want to talk about this is that right now I'm training for a half marathon. And for the first time ever in my training process, I'm being coached and I'm using technology to coach me through the training process. So I have run 2 marathons. I have run at least probably a dozen half marathons. I would consider myself an experienced runner, but not an expert runner, but probably not a beginning runner. And I know that there's areas that I can improve, but it's hard to do that on my own when I'm out there, for hours at a time. And so good old-fashioned modern technology, I can now have a coach literally talking in my ear during my entire run. And it's been interesting to watch my own process of really refining my form as I'm running. And this is very similar to when I talk about developing sales teams. More often than not, people on your team have some experience, right? If you're a small team, people who have come to your team have either been self-taught around sales, maybe they've learned sales at another company, maybe they have other types of business experience, but more often than not, they're not coming in completely green and completely fresh. And there's a lot of things that they're doing really well. And so we're not always talking about wholesale teaching somebody how to do sales. What we're really talking about when we talk about developing a sales team is refining the skills that your sales team has. How do we refine their skills in a way so that they're even more effective? And it's interesting as I think about running, how hard this is for adults. And we're going to dive into next week as we kind of wrap up our training on keeping your people happy, developing them, and how people learn a little bit more about why it's so hard. But what I really wanted to focus on today is to give you a tool and some principles that will make it easier for you to succeed in this process of refining your salespeople. And so I'm going to go back to my running example. So one of the things that I really love about these coached runs is that I have someone literally in my ear encouraging me, good job, you can do it. You didn't come this far only to come this far. And it's very helpful when I'm, 6+ miles in, it's starting to get hot, I'm tired, there's a hill up there. But what's been even more helpful than the encouragement is the form coaching and really the repetition of form coaching on some specific areas. Different coaches that I listen to coach it differently. There's everything from hand positioning to hip positioning to head positioning to, leaning forward to, shoulders. And it can be a lot to manage all at one time. And what I've noticed, and this is the most important thing here, is that when I try to focus on more than one form aspect at the same time, I don't succeed. But where I have the most success is when I pick one area of my form I'm going to work on for a run, and I hyper-focus on that, and typically hyper-focus on that for multiple weeks until I have body conditioning and muscle memory, and it feels natural. The reason I say this is there's a lot of parallels to your team. Your team members have experience. We talked about that. They're not learning from scratch. but they probably also have some bad habits, right? Some small nuances about the way that they're doing things that aren't optimal. Just like with my running, I have some form areas that are kind of weird and wonky. And I don't know where I learned that. And it doesn't help me, but my body just naturally wants to do that. And this is probably true for your sales team, whether it's the way that they address a certain question, the way they answer a question, the way they start a conversation, the way they move into negotiation. There's probably areas that they have little, I almost want to say ticks that they're not aware of that are hurting their successes. But if you try to fix them all at the same time, they're going to become very frustrated with you and you're not going to be setting them up for success. And so really the main thing I want to focus on this episode is the idea that if you want to refine and develop your sales team, to do that by focusing on one area at a time. And likely there's more than one area that your team could improve. Most of us, when it comes to sales, are really, really good at 2, maybe 3 aspects of the sales process. Maybe you have a team member who's great at research and strategic planning. Maybe you have a team member who's great at getting an initial appointment. Maybe you have a team member who is diligent and consistent on follow-up. Maybe you have a team member who's fantastic at asking questions, but really not great at getting succinct and to the point and delivering information, right? Maybe you have a team member who's great at winning the deal and getting the final yes. We all have areas that we're fantastic at, and we all have areas that we could use improvement in. Small improvements in each of these areas can lead to huge advancements in your company's results. But if you try to do them all at the same time, you're going to frustrate your team and you're likely not going to be successful. So what I really want to dive into in this particular episode is how do you choose an area to focus on when it comes to supporting your team's growth? So first and foremost, the most important thing is you do have to acknowledge that you do have to choose. That if you are trying to choose and you're like, well, let's do these 5 at the same time, you're already setting yourself up to be disappointed in the results. You can't choose multiple things at the same time. The more specific you can be in choosing one area to focus on, the bigger impact you're going to have faster. So instead of just choosing to get better at sales, choose to help your team get better at opening conversations or even the first 15 seconds of a cold outreach. Teach your team to really refine getting better at assumptively scheduling that first meeting, about going into pricing conversations confidently. Pick one area, do it over and over and over again with repetition until everyone on the team has muscle memory in its habit before you move on to one area. Then that begs the next question, how do you pick? So that's what I want to do now is I want to give you some different strategies on how to pick. So the first option of how to pick is to go with your gut. What's your first choice, right? Typically, our gut reactions are based on information that we've been observing over time, but not naming or not having the right questions to help us think through what we want to do. But when we ask ourselves a very specific question, more often than not, that first response is pretty spot on. So instead of just asking, where do I want my team to get better in sales? You can even be more specific about that. What would make my team more effective at sales this quarter? Or what would make my team more effective at making appointments this quarter? Or what would make my team more effective at scheduling more demos in the next 90 days? Right? So the more specific you can frame that question, the more spot on your initial gut reaction is going to be. Another way to think about this is to think about your team's skill level as it relates to hard skills and soft skills. So hard skills are things like asking questions, delivering a compelling value proposition, starting conversations, negotiating. They're specific around a part of the sales process and a specific skill around that. Versus soft skills are things that'll influence the entire sales conversation and process. Things like curiosity, resilience, leadership, confidence. So if you're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know where to start, we have 2 tools that can help you that you can download at mightysalesteams.com/skills. The first is a list of topics. So if you're stuck, here's what I want you to do. I want you to develop that list. I want you to download that list of topics. Again, mightysalesteams.com/skills. We'll put the link in the show notes. And here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at it first and just kind of make a gut reaction what you think would help your team have the biggest impact. And then the second thing I want you to do is have your team self-evaluate. So you can have your team take that list and evaluate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest and 1 being the lowest, and put together the cumulative scores for your team. And that's always a great place to start. What I like about using that self-evaluation as you maybe are starting to develop some more training and development culture and opportunities on your team is it helps get buy-in. It's not something you just picked, it's what the team picked as an opportunity. And salespeople want to be successful. So if you're saying this is what you chose as a team would help you be successful, you're getting that buy-in from them. So we'll put that tool available in the show notes. The other thing that you can do if you want to look at this kind of more holistically is we do have a sales audit that looks at the bigger picture of kind of your sales approach and sales strategy. That can be a great tool to also use to start evaluating where you want to start investing in your sales development opportunities. So we'll put that in the show notes as well. Just to recap what we've talked about so far, you've got to pick one area, be very specific, dial it in until you know it. It's muscle memory. It's like riding a bike, right? You can get on the bike. I shouldn't use riding a bike as an analogy. Every time I ride my mountain bike, I fall pretty hard. So I'm learning that skill, but it's like riding my cruiser bike. I'm going to be more specific there. You want that to be where every team member gets in every part of the sales process. And even then, there's small little things that we can always do to get better. Professionals have coaches for a reason. They're masters at their craft, and yet they're still looking for these small ways to win more. And that's what this refining approach should be for your team. Small ways that you can make adjustments in that have a big impact so your team can perform at the highest level possible. So the first opportunity is to go with your gut. If you're totally stuck, we've got a download for you. Have your team self-evaluate. The second way that you can really think about this is what is going to have the biggest ripple effect or cascading effect. So for me, when I'm running, right now, the number one skill that I've been focusing on as I train for this half marathon is hand positioning. It sounds so silly, but I notice I have my hands, I don't know how to describe it, but instead of being kind of just up and down like you would expect as a runner, it's like my fist is parallel to the ground. And I notice when I run like that, right, then my elbows are splayed out, and then my shoulders are up towards my ear, and then my head looks down. So not only is my hand positioning not at its maximum efficiency, but it throws everything else off in the upper body portion of my running form. And so just by focusing on hand positioning, I get improvements in a lot of other areas. So thinking about that from your sales team, is there a specific area where your team can get better that has a cascading effect? Is it, really around assumptive selling and taking an assumptive approach? Is it around asking good questions early on? Is it around setting expectations with the client, right? Like, is there one or two things that happen that if they really master that first or second, or that one small thing, it impacts 3 or 4 other things. So that's a great way to choose where to focus too, is if you don't have a strong gut reaction to one of these areas or a specific area, think about what's going to have the biggest cascading effect. The third thing that you can do when you're trying to pick which areas to focus on first is look at the data. But I'm going to warn you here. You got to be careful because the data is often only part of the story, and sometimes we can misinterpret it. When I say look at the data, what I mean is look at your numbers. Where are you struggling? Are you getting a lot of initial consults, but not moving the conversation beyond an initial meeting? Are you having a lot of demos, but no sales? Are you doing a lot of proposals, but not getting yeses? Or are you lagging in setting appointments? Break down your sales process and notice where the trouble arises. But the reason I say to be really careful here is that sometimes the data will misrepresent the problem. For example, if everyone is moving from a consult to a demo, but the sales process stalls after the demo, it could be easy to say, we've got to get better at our demo process, which might actually be true, but it might also be possible that you're not qualifying prospects or setting expectations in those consults, that you're getting a cheap yes, if you will, that isn't really getting engagement from the potential client before they move on the demo. So it could actually be a consult problem, not a demo problem. So I always recommend, if you're not sure, if you're looking at the number and you're like, is this really where the problem initiates? Start one phase before the problem becomes obvious, because then you'll get those cascading effects. So, right, if you have a demo problem, but the consult comes right before, start with really refining your skills in the consult process and making sure the team is dialed in on that before refining the demo process. And you'll notice you'll get a lot better buy-in, or impact faster, I should say. We've talked about 3 ways that you can choose where to focus your efforts to get the maximum results in developing your team. We've talked about using your gut instinct. We've actually talked about 4: using your gut, having your team self-evaluate, identifying what the cascading opportunities are, looking at the data. So here's what I want to say. These are all 4 perfectly great ways to choose where to start your development efforts, where to start your development focus. But the most important thing isn't what you choose, it's that you choose one thing and you obsess over it until it's second nature, until it's muscle memory. It goes back to the myth of multitasking. We think we will get more done if we multitask, but research shows we get less done, are less effective, and more stressed. If you try to refine multiple parts of the sales process with your team at the same time, your team is going to get frustrated, they're going to get discouraged, and they're not going to learn as quickly. So when we hyper focus on one small thing to improve, your team is going to learn faster and get better quicker, and they're going to be more engaged in the process. So like I said, right now for me and running, it's hand positioning. And so it's this small thing, but when I'm doing it correctly, I feel the difference. And I've been working on it for weeks and weeks and weeks. And just now I'm starting to think about hip positioning. But even when I'm thinking about hip positioning, I'm still like, are my hands where they need to be? But this has to be the most important thing. So pick one thing. I've given you some different strategies and tools. We'll put those resources in the show notes below if you're feeling stuck and want some other ideas, different ways of looking at it. And next week, I'm going to share some tips on how you can dive into the process of learning the one skill that you're going to pick to focus on so that your team is set up for success. We're going to talk about how adults learn, what to expect in that adult learning process, and how to get your team to buy in. But today, start by picking something that most of your team can make improvements in, and really start thinking about how you can dive into that until it's second nature for them. When you really dive into one area and master that before moving on to the next area of improvements, you'll see faster results overall. So we'll see you next week on Sales Fiction. In the meantime, make sure you subscribe to the podcast Sales Fiction so you get fresh episodes downloaded as soon as they are available. And if you are enjoying this podcast, we are new, so this is our 3rd episode. Share it with a friend. Share it with somebody that you know that is involved with a small sales team that can use support in getting that small sales team to get mighty results. We appreciate you sharing. Give us a quick review on iTunes, and we'll see you next week.